It's been almost 2 decades since a progressive Conservative leader was elected with a majority mandate and took the oath of office as Premier of Ontario. In 1999, it was Mike Harris. Today, it was Doug Ford, who campaigned, as his slogan said, for the people. Now, with his cabinet sworn in earlier today and the first strands of policy in view, what's ahead? Let's ask. Ginny Roth, senior consultant at Crestview Strategy and a PC party strategist. Kim Wright, vice president at Hill & Knowlton Strategies, previously an advisor to former Ontario NDP leader Howard Hampton. Sean Conway, public policy advisor at Gowlings WLG, a fellow at Ryerson Centre for Urban Energy, and for almost 30 years, a Liberal MPP. Keenan Aylwin, the Green Party of Ontario's 2018 candidate in the riding of Barrie Springwater Oro Medonte. Mark Toohey, radio host on News Talk 1010 and one-time chief of staff to the current Premier's brother. That'd be former Toronto Mayor Rob Ford. And Jessica Smith-Cross, who's the editor at QP Briefing. And we are delighted to welcome the cast of Ben-Hur to our program tonight. We got a lot of people here. Some tape from earlier today at the Ontario Legislature. It was one for the history books. Sheldon, go.
I, Doug Ford, swear that I will duly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trust reposed in me as Premier and President of the Council and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs of the Province of Ontario. So help me God.
Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the new Executive Council of Ontario.
Before we get to some of the particulars, I do want to start with the guy who a moment ago said to me, Pakin, you know you and I are the only fossils at this table. And that is because you're the only one around this table who's actually been through a day like this before, putting your hand on the Bible and swearing an oath, and was a minister of the Crown in the David Peterson government back in 1985. What is this day like for someone who goes through this?
Well, I must say that I walked by Queen's Park early this morning and just to have a look, and it was a day very much like this 33 years ago this week. Hot, humid. I had been strongly opposed to the idea of an outside ceremony, which ours was from start to finish. For me, actually, it was an hour of relief, actually, because my introduction to cabinet government was a bit unusual, and I won't bore you with the details, but I had been spending several days before the government changed, taking briefings about the famous school bill, and writing the school bill, which was the major issue of the 85 campaign.
Full funding for Catholic schools.
And
right.
So I just remember coming out onto the lawn that day after yet another multi-hour session with, oh my God, this is what we have to do. This is what we've promised. This is what it means.
This is what you signed up for.
But listen, it's a very happy occason, and I know a number of the people that were there today. And
actually, let's show it from the day. We got Sheldon.
Oh,
we got
please
this. Yeah,
don't.
what the heck? Here's the front page of the Toronto Star, as Sean Conway indicates. 33 years ago, there's David Peterson and wife Shelley. David, the 20th Premier of the province, walking in an outdoor ceremony to be sworn in by the then Lieutenant Governor, John Blackayard. And it didn't rain, and it was a beautiful day, and everybody had fun.
But let me just say this as well. When I looked at that tape, I have to say to anyone watching this who's got an interest in politics and maybe a political career, who among our illustrious panel of experts would have predicted 3 months ago that what we just saw a few hours ago was remotely possible? Johnny MacDonald, who knew something about politics and elections, once observed that elections were like horse races. He said, you tend to know a lot more about them once they're run. So this is a dramatic day in terms of what nobody saw coming a few months ago and what happened quite efficiently today.
As long as we're in the mood for poetry, Mark, I do have to point out that 4 years ago, the current Premier of Ontario was a defeated candidate for mayor, and many thought his political career was over. Here he is 4 years later. What's going through your head today?
I'm not that surprised. And once I knew he was in the race, all the calculus, all the Lego blocks were there for him to put it together. There's a strong sense in the Ford family that there is a destiny. And there was a very strong rivalry between the two Ford brothers, Rob and Doug. And when Rob became mayor, I think that was the impetus for Doug to want to one-up him. And really the lowest level you could achieve and be better and higher in stature, I think, in the minds of the Fords than the mayor of Toronto is Premier of Ontario. So it was clearly part of his objective. And there will be somebody in this family, the Ford family, that will tonight be aspiring to become Prime Minister of Canada.
Who's it going to be?
I don't know yet.
But you've thought about this.
Oh, they have thought about this.
They have thought about it.
But Mark does remind me of something I would just want to say very quickly. I wonder what was going through the mind a few hours ago of the current mayor of Toronto.
John Tory. Was he thinking that could have been me?
I think it's best left
Unsaid.
private speculation.
Okay.
I think there were a lot of people watching television and in that audience today that were thinking that should have been me.
That's a
Okay,
good point.
Ginny, you were down there earlier today.
I was.
What's going through your head right now?
Well, to quote Doug Ford, quoting a proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. I think that was my takeaway from today, and I think it was probably a lot of people's. And I think that means two things. One, Doug Ford's going to break with convention. He'll continue to do it, and he'll continue to surprise people. Two, he's going to break with convention in ways that people don't expect.
Well, here's one of them right there. After the outdoor ceremony was over, he took his oath inside, then took it again outside, quote unquote, for the people. And after the formalities were over and done with, Ginny, he said, okay, now I'm going to go talk to some of my friends. And he darted right into the crowd, started to hug and pose for selfies. And, you know, I got to tell you, it was really something.
This is a guy at his happiest and at his best. Now, part of that is at the beginning of anyone's mandate, the politician is sort of in the most favor and has the most to lose. But he was clearly, I think, humble. I think many people noted there was sort of a tear in his eye as he was being sworn in, certainly the first time, and thrilled, frankly, to be sort of amongst the people. The For the People jingle was blaring out of the loudspeakers after the national anthem, and he was in his moment. But on this breaking with what you might expect of him, you know, we'll talk about cabinet. This is a guy who said, I'm going to put experience before everything else because I'm not going to screw up in the first couple of years in my mandate, and I'm not going to put that up to chance. So I'm impressed with the cabinet he struck.
We will hold off on that.
Yeah.
We're going to go, I guess, almost person by person through the cabinet in just a few moments. But let's get some more reaction just on the day itself. What's your thought?
The sun shone on the new premier for sure, and I think he couldn't have scripted a better day. I think the lack of air conditioning in the Legislative Assembly always takes everyone by surprise if you're not used to it. But this was Premier Ford's day, and he was surrounded by the people that mattered to him, including his mother, and I was glad to see that she was there and in attendance. I've also seen a different tone from him from the campaign, from the moment he became Premier Designate, that press conference he did right after the election, not the one that evening, but the one the next morning. Very Premier. I thought it was a much more controlled situation, but also seeing how he wants to govern is very different than how you campaign. And I think we saw that in the cabinet today. And I think it'll be different once we start getting into an actual legislative session, but he's making the right moments and he's taking in this honeymoon as much as he can.
I think a lot of people noticed today, Keenan, that Premier Ford did say during his speech, to those of you out there who didn't vote for me, give me a chance. I want to prove to you that I can represent you too. What did you think when you heard that?
It's encouraging because before Ford wasn't really willing to work with people, but now it seems like he wants to cooperate with people, work together to solve some of the challenges we face, and I think that's what Ontarians want. They're sick of the excessive partisanship at Queen's Park. It's a mess. So it's encouraging to see because we have big challenges ahead and we have to work together to solve them.
Jessica, you were down there earlier today. What are your impressions tonight you want to share?
That's right. I spent the day talking to the people who'd come to visit, so that was really interesting. There are some very committed people there who really love Doug and really love the Ford family. Almost everybody I talked to mentioned the Fords as a family. They mentioned Rob. One woman talked to me about how she gets teary every time she thinks about how Doug had won. Standing right next to her, though, there was a guy with a sign telling he was Islamophobic and proud of it. So there's all kinds of people came because the doors were open. Well, there were no doors. Everybody could come.
You know, we talked a second ago about some of the Ford family members who were there, and Renata Ford was there, the late mayor's widow, and her 2 children. And she's suing the premier right now. That's right. And she was there. Anybody surprised about that?
Yes.
Yes, okay, so I wasn't the only one. You're not, Kim.
Not surprised at all. At the end of the day, this is a family that will come together regardless of their challenges, and especially for Renata and Rob's children, Stephanie and Doug, this mattered to them. To Mark's point earlier about, what is the next set of family dynasties? If anybody thinks that Stephanie and Dougie aren't being contemplated at some point, then they've never seen a Kennedy documentary of how far down the road they move forward. So it is part of the family. Mike Ford was there, Councillor Mike Ford from the City of Toronto was there. There were a lot of people that were there. This was a family moment, as much as a Conservative family moment, but it was a family moment.
Steve, can I just add quickly a historical fact of some, I thought, interest today. 33 years ago, on an occasion very similar to this, the then Premier invited people in to a reception. I think you'll know this story, and said something like, "This is your place of government. Come in and have some strawberries and cake or whatever.
Without walls or barriers. Government without walls or barriers.
So the reception, swearing in, I think, was at 11. The reception was 12:30 till 2. And our first cabinet meeting was at 2 o'clock that afternoon. So I had never been in cabinet before, and I'm sitting at the first cabinet meeting, and all of the order and protocol, and the business begins. And some of our friends here wouldn't remember Ed Stewart, but a legendary public servant, very senior executive. He was Secretary of the Cabinet. The meeting was probably 15 minutes old, and Ed Stewart leaned over to me and said, "That woman over there by the wall, she belongs to the Premier's office, does she?" And I said, "Sir, no. I thought she belonged to you." And what had happened is a citizen, middle-aged woman, had just done what she could only have done that day. She managed to walk in through the double doors, and somebody thought she was X and somebody else thought she was Y, and she very calmly sat and took a seat in the corner of the cabinet room and watched the proceedings for 15 or 20 minutes, after which she was quickly shown the door. But I always thought it was, we missed her. We didn't get a chance to get her name and get her interviewed, but I was thinking about that today. When
That's
I was watching
adorable.
this.
Well, to the best of my knowledge, you want to bring up this shot, Sheldon? To the best of my knowledge, all the people in this picture are actually members of the cabinet. I don't think there are any interlopers in there. They've all been appointed. You see in the front row, of course, Premier Ford, the 26th Premier of the province, the Lieutenant Governor, Elizabeth Dowdeswell, beside him, and then beside her, the Deputy Premier and Minister of Health, Christine Elliott. Beside Doug Ford, there's Vic Fedeli, who's the Minister of Finance. It is a cabinet that we're going to talk about right now because 21 members, so much smaller than the previous. There are 5 rookies. There are 7 women. And what does that make? What's my math here? 7 women and if it's 21, I'll look at 14, right? So 2-to-1 difference.
That's new math.
Awful. Can you believe it? It's the last program of this season, that's why. 2-to-1 men to women. 1 visible minority, that'd be Raymond Cho in Scarborough. 2 cabinet ministers in the entire 416. That has caught some people's interest. 2 from the north, none from Mississauga, none from Brampton, none from Kitchener-Waterloo. Here come the maps. In the top left-hand corner, you can see that's Kenora, so that's 1 from the north. As you go down south and further east, obviously, you can only put a cabinet together with seats that you won. And there are a lot of places where the Conservatives didn't win seats. There, at the very bottom, on top of Lake Ontario, is the 416. 2 seats in the 416. It's got to be the smallest representation in the 416 ever. Hang on, Sean, let me get through this. Hang on. Then these other blue patches, these other blue ridings in the 905. 1 from Peel, a few from Durham, 2 Durham, 3 York, 6 from the east. Okay, I've laid it out. Discuss.
Your map is incorrect because there's a cabinet minister from Etobicoke, and that's the Premier.
He's the Premier.
And I think that counts for a couple of cabinet ministers. But,
Thank you very much, Mark.
Yeah, I think it's a cabinet that, interestingly enough, the argument would be made by the Premier and his staff, I'm sure, that they put together a cabinet based on skill, experience, capability, not on how do we make the nicest looking photograph for the front page of the Toronto Star so that we can do the math that we just did and add up and divide by?
You don't think citizens do that math? You don't think people in Kitchener-Waterloo are saying, we have nobody, we overwhelmingly voted Tory and we have nobody in the cabinet?
I don't think they do. I think people like us who can spend, a wonderful time on a long weekend Friday to talk about what just happened, will parse this to the nth degree. But I don't think the average person who voted for Doug Ford from the breadth and width of this province really gives a damn about the color of anybody's skin.
There is actually regional balance. So sorry, Keenan. There is regional balance. There are 2 MPPs from the ministers now from southwestern Ontario, where I'm from, Monty McNaughton and Ernie Hardeman. There are ministers from
and
Toronto.
Jeff Hurek too, actually. Jeff, you
right.
could say 3.
Sorry. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. My apologies, Minister. But there are ministers that are geographically balanced, which, frankly, for the Conservatives to win seats in Toronto was a big deal for them. This showed a lot of electoral map change. And I think you have to strike a balance of how many cabinet seats you're going to have if you're only going to hit 21 ministers. How do you divvy that up? I think he did, on balance, quite a decent job, and hitting those ministers he needed to reward. People who have been loyal to him, and the Fords reward loyalty above all else. Having spent time at City Hall with the Ford administration previously, they reward it beyond everything else. And there was electoral balance, there was experience, and there was certainly competency. And then you see the parliamentary assistants.
Okay, Keenan?
Representation matters. That's all well and good, but if we only have one visible minority in cabinet, only 7 women, that matters. We have no one below the age of 40. This isn't reflective of the province of Ontario, and I think Ontarians do care about that. Maybe not the 40% that voted for Doug Ford, but the 60% that didn't vote for Doug Ford, I think it matters. And I think we're starting to find out who the people that Doug Ford talks about when he says a government for the people, who those people actually are, and who those people aren't.
Look, Ford's mandate is patently not about quotas. In fact, they sort of kicked the bums out who were sort of obsessed with that kind of showmanship around quotas, but lack of delivery and actually giving people what they wanted. So I think when you have this strong a mandate and backing for an agenda, you get to make these kind of choices and say, people have told us what they want, and our cabinet's representative insofar as they're going to deliver on the expectations we committed to. And some of this is coming from the fact that Doug Ford and his transition team were presented with, frankly, an embarrassment of riches. I think you could make at least 2 cabinets, if not 3, with sort of the amount of talent that was elected and the size of the caucus in a majority government. And they've dealt with that by saying, we're going to go with experience first. Because I think when the transition team interviewed some of these people, they realized, oh, actually, the guys who've been around for a few years know where the bathrooms are. They know how committees work. They know how ministries are organized. They'll be able to stand up to their public servants. And then we're going to try out some of those really impressive rookies in PA jobs and parliamentary assistant jobs. And that's going to be a really impressive audition round, I think, to see, when the first cabinet minister screws up, which someone will, that always happens, there's going to be a ton of bench strength to replace those people with. And as the government ages, move into those positions of power.
My concern is the ministries themselves and the portfolios that some of these ministers are getting. I look at Minister Rickford putting in energy, Northern Development Mines, Indigenous Affairs. His list of portfolios could have easily been given a couple of extra cabinet roles. They had the room going down from 28 to whatever they wanted to go to. I think they could have done that, but it also shows where their priorities are.
Let me get Sean and then Jessica.
Well, just a couple of things. I think there's always a tendency to compare what human beings do in matters like cabinet formation against some celestial ideal. If you're about a celestial ideal, clearly this fails that test. I think all things considered, they did quite a good job, and I was particularly struck by some things. Let me just quickly rattle off 2 or 3 of them. One, we have what we rarely get, which is a bona fide Torontonian leading the provincial government. Doug Ford is really...
Third Torontonian to be
Well,
premier?
that's not, I wouldn't even say the
Kathleen
third. Probably,
Wynne, Bob Ray.
Well, yeah, Kathleen Wynne and Bob, Bob Ray was a man of the diplomatic world, we brought up, my friend Bob Nixon used to say, with the something about the log cabin in Washington or something.
He grew up in a log embassy.
A log embassy. But so you've got, and Mark's right. I mean, yes, there technically, I guess, just 2 from 416. One of them is premier. And let's be My friend here from the Green Party studied politics at Queen's University. If you took classical political science, you'd be focused on a cabinet government. But we're no longer a cabinet government. We're more and more presidential-style government, and all three parties in government in Ontario have had that tendency. So make no mistake about it, ministers are interesting. Some will perform better than others. Some will have some real influence. But the real power center of this government, make no mistake about it, is going to be the Premier's office. A couple of other quick things. Lisa Thompson, Minister of Education from Huron County. I thought very interesting. I don't know Ms. Thompson, but I can tell you that if you're in that part of Ontario that is static or depopulating, the education challenge is very considerable, and it's of a very different kind that you would find in the Toronto suburbs or Kitchener-Waterloo or the Ottawa area. Final point, the North, only 2 members. That's right, there were 3, I think, elected to the government party.
Yep.
Minister of Finance and the Rickford file, those are 2 very important people with very powerful jobs to do, and very, as Kim mentioned, a lot on their plate. So I think one needs to take a more qualitative look at the people and the mandates versus just some kind of antiseptic accounting metric.
JSC is going to be anything but antiseptic here. Go ahead, Jessica, it's all yours.
I just wanted to weigh in on the question of whether Ford's voters care about the demographic makeup of cabinet. I was talking to one of the Ford fans today who comes from Ghana, and he was telling me all about how there have been a lot of promotions of women to powerful positions, which he thinks is a wonderful thing. It's something he genuinely cares about. He thinks they're good in government, women. He also thinks they're less corrupt. I just don't think we can generalize about who cares about that kind of thing and who doesn't.
But I think, though, that we are not in an era of normal governments. What we've seen in Toronto, in the United States with the presidential race, here in Ontario, is not just sort of a backlash against a party that's been in power for a long time, although that was a big part of the sentiment. It's a backlash against government as usual, the status quo. It doesn't matter who you vote for, red, yellow, blue, orange, you get, nobody votes green, but
They did in Guelph.
they did really well, like Guelph actually. You get the same, doesn't help me. Right? This is a much more pragmatic vote, and I think you'll see a much more pragmatic government, at least at the outset, focused on let's get stuff done rather than let's look really good doing it.
I think one of the challenges the new Premier will have is his legislative experience comes from municipal affairs and City of Toronto, which deals with, at any given council meeting, which one just finished in the wee small hours of this morning, 258 some items in one meeting. The glacial pace of some of the Queen's Park legislative process, I think, will frustrate the new Premier. And I think that will be a challenge for him and his staff to manage that going forward.
But can I also make the point that I heard the proverb being intoned today as well, and it was quite heartfelt and touching. And I say this carefully. I watched a civic administration at Toronto between 2010 and 2014. Wow, that was quite a show. That was really quite something. And so
I think the guy beside you knows all about it.
Do you want to credit for that?
Well, no, I mean, but all I'm saying is that we now have a promise, a populist promise, which I think, as Mark says, is very much, I think, the impulse of the times. But remember, Doug Ford got precisely 3% more votes. He got 40.5. Tim Hudak got 37.5, losing badly 4 years ago. So, and I thought I heard in the Premier's message a recognition of that this, when Mike Harris won, he won with 45%. When Bill Davis won, he won with 45%. When Dalton McGuinty won 15 years ago, he won with 46%. 40.5, he's got a clear and strong mandate. But his numbers, I think he's got to be cognizant of it. I would be careful. Yes.
Jenny?
And I think we saw that today. I mean, to Sean's point, you can be populist without being chaotic. There has been no sense through this transition period of, frankly, any chaos. If anything, there's been caution. And I think you see that in the appointment of the Finance Minister, Vic Fedeli. Doug Ford, Vic Fedeli. Vic Fedeli, not only Finance Minister, but caucus chair. Cabinet chair. So he'll be essentially running cabinet meetings. That's a huge amount of trust that Doug Ford's putting in him. And it speaks to this guy was the interim leader. And if Doug Ford had acted sort of the caricature of that the left wants to sort of portray of him, he might have said, I'm going to keep that guy on a short leash. I'm not going to have him anywhere near me because I want my mandate to sort of to reign, and I'm the one that was elected. He's brought Vic Fedeli, who really, I think, embodies the previous caucus. He's beloved. There's a reason he was sort of unanimously made interim leader over that period of tumult. And he symbolically represents a lot of them, and Doug Ford has rewarded him and given him a lot of power, and I think that's a very cautious moment of outreach to the party and the party stalwarts.
I'm going to ask Sheldon Osmond, our director, just can you bring the cabinet picture up again? Because I want to just pick out a few ministers and then have our group here discuss them. In the top left of that picture, the guy with the blue tie, that's Peter Bethlen-Fulvey. Pickering-Uxbridge MPP, rookie MPP, he's the president of the Treasury Board. He's a guy, now that's a job that nobody knows what the hell it's about, but the fact is you can't spend anything in government until Treasury Board approves it, and he's the president of the Treasury Board of Cabinet. Very powerful, very influential position. Right beside him is Caroline, no, keep it up, we're going to do a little more here. Right beside him is Caroline Mulroney, another rookie. There are 5 rookies in this cabinet. She, of course, the daughter of a former prime minister, attorney general, and minister for Francophone Affairs, one of the, I think, 2 members today of cabinet who took their cabinet oath in both official languages. Can I do one more? Go right across to the right-hand side now. Michael Tibolo, a rookie MPP, met the Ford family. He's 30 years in addictions, dealing with addiction and mental health. Met the Fords when Rob Ford was going through his travails. And the only person sworn in today who gave the Premier a big, long hug. It was really a very emotional moment. They've become very good friends over Rob's difficulties. And beside him is Rod Phillips, another one of these sort of star candidates, rookie MPP again, but somebody who's been around politics for a very long time. He is the Environment Minister, and it's not called Environment and Climate Change anymore. It's just called Environment, Conservation and Parks, which is a different name. And it's going to be his job, I guess, to fight with the federal government over how they're going to handle carbon tax or cap and trade or whatever the heck they're going to be doing. Okay, with those laid out, discuss. Who wants in? Go ahead.
The worrying thing is that, you know, Rod Phillips used to be the OLG chair.
Lottery and gaming.
And I think he's gambling with the future of our children and grandchildren being able to have a livable future. He's gambling with that.
By canceling cap and trade?
The biggest cry, and Steve was there, that went up during Doug Ford's speech in the crowd today was when he said he'd already canceled cap and trade. That was the loudest cheer he got by that crowd. So,
and we're already seeing the effects of that. Investment is leaving the province. It's bad for business. It's bad for business.
But can I come back to the first point you made about I think the most powerful guy in the first part of this mandate is going to be the Secretary of the Treasury Board, because the Ford agenda is one where they have got to find billions of dollars in savings. And I just want to remind the panel and the audience that roughly 50 cents of every dollar every provincial government spends is in healthcare. And it's a lot easier to talk about cutting budgets provincially than it is in doing them. And I know people are going to say, well, we're going to leave healthcare alone, and then you add education, then you get to 2/3 of program spending is in health and education. Where are we going to get those savings? Well, we're going to find them in infrastructure. Really? Well, that'll be interesting for Mr. Monty McNaughton and the mayor of Toronto and the other mayors who said, we've got to get more trains and more whatever. So, and the other person that we have yet to talk about is the deputy premier, because I'm the secretary of the Treasury Board. I'm going to be looking, despite all the rhetoric, health, we've got to constrain. One of the things that Couillard and Wynne, I don't think, got enough credit for, and they certainly I think Kathleen Wynne in the last couple of years probably turned the screws too tightly, was in the healthcare area. And it's not just patients, it's doctors, it's nurses, it's nurse practitioners, it's tens of thousands of professional intermediaries that have very real political clout. Ms. Elliott, how are you doing on the requirements of a Treasury Board to meet the savings that we've got to achieve?
And get rid of hallway medicine.
And get rid of hallway medicine.
Hallway medicine will be key
Wow,
on
this is going to be
talk
so...
about your infrastructure challenges. The amount of beds that have been contemplated within every single day of announcements over the campaign, frankly, by all three parties, will require a lot of investment and a lot of time and energy. And I think rightfully so, because how we treat people is how we are seen as a province. But I think that's going to be one of the challenges that they have for Treasury. But what is interesting to see is who made it into cabinet today based on a lot of the who did some of the heavy lifting during the campaign. And as I said earlier, the Fords value loyalty above all else. So you saw the new president of Treasury Board doing some of those heavy lifting press conferences, throwing a couple of elbows here and there. You saw Todd Smith doing that. Lisa MacLeod has been always out front and center, being prepared to do what needs to be done. So I think there is a reward to that. But these are also capable people. And I think that we will watch that unfold. There are not prototypical cabinet ministers, and nor should there be.
But this agenda, make no mistake about it, this agenda, and they're very talented people. Christine Elliott, the man with the name, which I can't pronounce,
Bethlen
Falvey. Boy, those are really tough assignments for very capable people. Carolyn Mulroney looks to me like a big winner. I think she's going to sleep a lot more comfortably over the next few months, maybe years, than the poor Minister of Health.
Although she is going to have challenges with legalization of marijuana coming forward, and how that will unfold.
I worked on Carolyn's leadership, and she doesn't sleep very easily because she's a crazy hard worker. So I think you're probably right that it's not one of the tougher files. But I think she also will end up being subbed in. To Kim's point, I mean, the Premier recognizes he needs surrogates on issues, frankly, that are of his concern. If he's out of the legislature, people need to answer questions in his place. I think Christine Elliott is choice number one for that, and Caroline Mulroney is a close number second.
Can I get Mark Toohey in on this? I know that there was a great deal of speculation before the cabinet was announced that there was going to be a lot of restructuring of government. They were going to take Ministry A, B, and C, put them all together, create a new super ministry, give a lot of power to a strong minister. We saw some name changes here. We didn't see a lot of that kind of restructuring government. Will Conservatives be disappointed in that?
I think Conservatives are thrilled that they're government. So I think the disappointment will be moderated. But it's hard to make those changes. And when you're talking about restructuring governments, you're talking about massive changes in the infrastructure and the way the system works. What I expect we'll probably see are, a wholesale change in deputy ministers across all of these portfolios.
Well, they announced that today already.
Yeah. And because you want to shake that up, even if for nothing else than just to create the opportunity for somebody to get promoted. But they need brand new ideas because the public service has been producing the same ideas forever.
They got a deputy minister of red tape reduction now.
Yeah. And so, but I would think once you get the new deputy ministers in place, they'll have some time, maybe later in the mandate, around a cabinet shuffle time, there'll be some time to restructure some things once they've figured out where you actually can achieve savings by doing that. Because it's, quite frankly, I think, hard to figure out from the outside.
Including a change in deputy minister in health, which was a pretty large signal to the province and the public servant writ large.
Steve, the thing about government architecture, I think I like what I saw today because if you go back 40 years to Mr. Davis, when he won that big mandate in 1971, they almost self-destructed, in part because they had sent a bunch of people off to Harvard. The Trudeau crowd in Ottawa were doing the same thing, and they all came back suffused with these wonderful constructs. And remember 1975? Jimmy, the number of people that were defeated they almost lost. And the question is, I think the public, Mark's public and Doug Ford's public, they care about results. And if you've learned anything from people, old wily foxes like Jean Chrétien, do it. And do it if you have to with conventional architecture rather than the other way around, because I can tell you the experience, the actual lived experience in places like Ontario and Canada would make one very careful and cautious about getting too far down that path.
Jessica, I want to bring you in on the issue of, 76 MPPs to choose from. You've already decided the Premier he wants a smaller cabinet. So you're going to have a lot of disappointed people. Obviously, with all the speculation going on ahead of time, there are some names that are not on this list that some people thought surely would be on that list. Want to name any of them?
Oh, geez. I think most of the people who were the stars of the opposition of the last 4 years are on that list. He did a very good job of covering them off, which is a remarkable change. If you remember, he entered the race blaming the Toronto elites for not wanting him into it. During the leadership race, he had people like Todd Smith, who's in cabinet, calling him erratic and out of control, saying that, if he wins the leadership, we're in for certain defeat. So that's evolved. I actually can't think of anyone who was playing a huge role in the last term that was passed over at all.
I guess Doug Ford, late in the campaign, had a couple of press conferences, not on his own, but with a bunch of would-be MPPs around his table saying, folks, if you elect me, you get them. And the idea was unmistakable. This is what my cabinet's going to look like. Donna Skelly from the Hamilton area was one of those people. She didn't make it into cabinet. Doug Downey from your neck of the woods. You ran against?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people had him as Attorney General because he's a lawyer.
Real estate lawyer, though.
Okay, he didn't make it in either.
Wow.
Wow. When the rubber hit the road
from Tim Hudak, if that's it.
Yeah.
That's right.
When the rubber hit the road, they chose experience. And I think, look, when you talk about caucus management, which is a challenge for any new premier, when you're a rookie, you give the guy that helped you get elected as premier a lot of credit, and you got a lot of time for them. So I think the Doug Downeys, the Donna Skellys, others who have parliamentary assistant roles. So that means a salary bump. That means a way to spend your time. You're certainly well occupied, and you've got a lot of time for the new premier because, frankly, in part, you got elected on his coattails. Not to say they didn't work hard. Of course they did. But Justin Trudeau's caucus was in a very similar position. A lot of these rookies are saying, I got elected thanks to Doug Ford and Ford Nation, so I'm kind of ready to step in line for a while. That only lasts so long, and then people sort of expect a promotion. But for now, I think rewarding experience made sense.
I would like to go back to a point that Sean made earlier. Does cabinet really matter that much? And I'm thinking with a premier like Doug Ford, he hasn't really demonstrated an ability to play well with others during his time at City Council. So I'm thinking, these people are capable. But if they go to Doug Ford, is he going to listen?
Can I pick up another person we haven't talked about and part of the agenda that is really important, and that's Jim Wilson and economic development. One of the things about being in government is that you've got your own agenda, and then there are events. And what's going on in the United States, especially on the trade file, has got to be occupying the attention of the people at Queen's Park in a very real and material way. Jim Wilson probably has more government experience than provincial government experience of anybody in this cabinet.
Been there since 1990.
28 years a member, was a minister when it really mattered in energy, when they were restructuring Ontario Hydro. After 3 or 4 years of that headache, he was moved into health, where he got to do all the wonderful things there with hospital restructuring and related matters. So Wilson brings considerable experience. But the NAFTA file is a matter, as we used to say in Parliament, of urgent and pressing necessity. It's going to bring the Ontario and federal government together, as we've seen already between Messrs. Trudeau the younger and Ford the younger in this file. Interestingly, the carbon file is going to probably drive them apart in a way, because we are getting a carbon tax on the basis of current arrangements. It's now simply going to be applied on the biggest subnational jurisdiction in Ontario by the federal government. That, I suspect, is going to cause some creative tension.
Well, unless they go to court and have it overturned.
Well, whatever. I mean, but the NAFTA file, and again, if you're the Minister of Finance, you've got to be thinking, we've got to reduce and eliminate a deficit, we've got to cut gas taxes, we've got to do a variety of other big ticket items.
He mentioned this. Let's play this here, because again, we said he got sworn in inside, then he did it again outside. When he came outside, the Premier gave a speech in which he certainly outlined some of what he thought would be his top priorities going forward. Sheldon, let's do a clip of that, please. Go.
We're eliminating the cap and trade carbon tax. The first steps to lowering gas prices. We're initiating a full audit of the government spending, line item by line item. A review that will result in billions, that's billions of dollars of savings for Ontarians. We will open Ontario for business, open Ontario for investment and trade, and we will return Ontario to its rightful place as the economic engine of this great country.
Mark, I don't know who wrote the speech, but there was a ton of applause lines there, and they all worked.
That's the stuff that the people who voted for him want the government to focus on. They're less concerned, I think, with the trappings of political correctness and things that are done just for show. And they're more concerned about show me how this touches my life and do it fast. They will expect rapid change and improvement in their circumstance. So this government, I think, will be looking for some quick wins in terms of things that they can do by regulation or by, they've got the simple legislation to get quickly through in terms of taxes and that kind of stuff. They'll figure out how to pay for it later,
Let's
hopefully.
talk about what they've already done. They've already said, hey, deputy ministers, public servants, no more free lunches. You don't get to expense your lunches to the sort of bill of the people, as it were. And caucus is going to have the same experience. They've got to brown bag their own lunches. Those kind of immediate pieces of action, I think we'll see movement on the gas tax this summer. Because that's when people, they drive up to the cottage and they think about how much it is to fill their tank.
If you owned an oil company and they reduced the gas tax by 10 cents, why wouldn't you raise your price by 10 cents since people are already accustomed to paying for that, just to, increase your profits?
I can answer that.
Okay.
Because when you're running an industry like that, you're heavily regulated. You don't want to be more regulated.
Okay. But let me get very granular on this. So I agree, absolutely. Make politicians pay for their lunch. I have no problem. That's less than 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/2 of 1 cent in the budget. Let's talk infrastructure. Let's be very specific. I heard that speech and I was elevated by the optimism, and I think he did do the right thing. It reminded me of Real Coet pitching social credit 40, 50 years ago, and that worked too for a while. But let's talk infrastructure. Big ticket, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure. I'm thinking, for example, not to be too sensitive and too particular, of a single-stop subway station in metropolitan Toronto that was launched, I think, at $2.5 or $3 billion. At last check is now $4.5 billion, apparently on its way to $5 billion. I heard the Board of Trade the other day talking about double-tracking the 401 out at the airport. I don't hear anybody talking about how and where are we getting the billions and billions of dollars that we've got to find to upgrade the infrastructure in the GT and HA and elsewhere.
Can we say, because we're out of time, to be continued?
Well, that's the real challenge before this government of very talented men and women.
I'm sure the leader's office of the official opposition will have lots to say about that come the fall setting.
And that is the NDP in this next House, let us remember.
But Toronto and Ontario, if you look at a project in
Sean.
Scarborough about a subway,
Keeps going.
let
Nothing's
that be
changed.
a cautionary
It's
tale.
it's like the old days of doing fourth reading here 20 years ago. I couldn't get him to stop then. I can't get him to stop now. A glorious day in the province of Ontario, not to be too corny, but when power transfers peacefully, it is not a frequent thing in this world, and we should celebrate when it happens here in our midst. Thank you all for coming in tonight for this discussion here on TVO.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.